I'm Starborn. Remember, to be a star, you have to shine your own light, follow your own path, and not be afraid of the darkness, because that's when stars shine brightest. Tonight, we're not going to have regular predictions for each sun sign. Instead, I'm going to do a discussion of relationships, something that can all be dear to our hearts. And I'm going to discuss 4 different kinds of relationships and the aspects that indicate that between your chart and someone else's. And so the first kind of relationship is, of course, a very good relationship. And in fact, even though I'm going to be talking about 3 different aspects that indicate that, you only need 1 for a very good marriage or a wonderful partnership or a great contract that could last a lifetime. And then I'll be discussing 3 aspects that indicate a bad relationship. So you'll have that and to know about, and then you'll know what to look out for. There's also another kind of wonderful relationship called an enlightened relationship, and I'll explain what that means too. And then the last relationship I'm going to talk about is a frustrating relationship. Have you ever been in one of those where no matter how badly you want it to work, it just doesn't? Well, there are aspects that can indicate that type of thing. So we will be talking about all 4 relationships and the different aspects, and I hope from that you will be able to sort of learn a few things. What is the first indication for a good relationship? Well, actually, remember I said there are 3 different good aspects, but the first one is a great one, and that is when your sun sign is in the same sign as someone else's moon. This is called the conjunction of the lights, and the planets don't have to be conjuncting, but generally they are in the same sign. And the wonderful thing about that can make for a very good marriage or a long-lasting relationship is that the person who has their sun in that sign has a lot of insight into the other person, and they always see them at their best, and they have sort of a sunny disposition and want things to turn out very well. The person who has the moon in the same sign is very nurturing and understanding, and where the sun sign person has a lot of insight, the moon sign person has a lot of ability to understand things without even having a conversation about them. So there's quite a bit of sympathy and empathy coming from the person who has their moon there. So a sun-moon conjunction is an absolutely excellent indication of a lifelong relationship, and that is a marriage tie. So that is a good thing to look for. What is another indication of a good relationship? Well, another indication of a good relationship is one that can make you very popular, and that is when Venus in one person's chart is in the same sign as Jupiter in another person's chart. And that's because Venus is the planet of love and compatibility and balance and fairness and harmony, and Jupiter is the planet of goodness and abundance, and it certainly does rule a person with a good sense of humor. So a couple that would have this Venus and Jupiter in the same sign is an indication of somebody who's extremely popular, and as a couple they are very good-humored and they always want to have fun. So if you know somebody that always makes you laugh, that's probably somebody whose Jupiter is pretty close to your Venus, and that it can make an extremely harmonious marriage or business partner, or it can make for a very long-lasting contract. What is the next aspect that indicates a good relationship? Well, this is an aspect between charts that is often overlooked but is terribly important, and it is when the ascendants or the rising signs are harmonious. In other words, there are 3 lights in every person's chart: the sun, the moon, and the ascendant. The ascendant is your own special star. It's the point where the sun is coming over the horizon at the date, time, and place where you were born. And so that's very special. And so the ascendants I'm talking about now indicate compatibility for the whole chart. They set the elements and the house system for the whole chart. And so there are 4 elements: fire, air, earth, and water. When someone with a fire sign rising meets someone with an air sign rising, those are very compatible ascendants, and that is because the air fans the flame. It keeps the fire burning brightly. And so they need each other. That's what makes them compatible. Yes, they work in different ways, but they're compatible ways. And so these two ascendants, fire and air, regardless of what sun sign they are going to be very compatible. The other indication of a compatible relationship among ascendants is when one person has an earth sign rising and the other person has a water sign rising. This is very harmonious because, of course, in order to grow something in the good earth, you need water. And so the water is nurturing, and the earth sign person nurturing to the earth sign person, and the earth sign person who has this rising in their chart. Remember, I'm not talking about sun signs, I'm talking about rising signs. That earth person can feel the support and the sympathy of the water sign person, and they can want to take root and make things grow and stick together for longevity. So those two ascendants are very harmonious as well. However, there are other kinds of relationships. What makes for a bad relationship? Well, there are three aspects that indicate bad relationships, and I'm sure we've all had relationships like that. The first aspect of a relationship that can be quite difficult is when the sun sign of one person is opposing the moon sign of the other. These two people just don't understand each other very well at all, and they don't see eye to eye, or they don't have the ability to be empathetic or supportive. So that kind of an opposition may draw them together because they say opposites attract, but they don't have much in common, and so that can make for a lot of misunderstanding, and that can be difficult to live with. And so what makes another aspect of a bad relationship? Well, actually, there is an old saying, and it is that you should never marry anyone who has Mars or Saturn on your lights. And the reason why is that these are two malefic planets, and you only need one to have a really bad relationship. So if Mars in one person's chart was on your sun or your moon or your ascendant, remember those are the three lights that every person has in their chart, it simply means that that person with that Mars can be extremely controlling, and it is an indication that they can be jealous and angry. And since Mars is a very dynamic, passionate planet, it means that they want to control you, and they'll do it. In other words, they'll work you to death, or they'll want you to be busy, and then even if you want to rest, they'll give you something else to do, and they never are going to quit. And that can be a bad relationship because it simply makes you the doer and the other one the boss, and that isn't fair or equitable at all. What's another aspect that makes for a bad relationship? Well, a bad relationship can actually come from something really good. At least it starts well, but it does not end well. And that is when one person's Venus, the planet of love, is in the same sign as someone else's Mars. This makes for an instant attraction. This is love at first sight. This indicates a very passionate relationship that's just got to end in marriage. And both people think it's love, but it isn't. And that is because Mars is such a dominant planet and Venus is such an agreeable, compromising planet. And so people who have this absolutely wonderful sexual relationship at the start of the relationship and decide to get married are often very disappointed because things change. And what happens is that as the relationship continues, the person who has Mars there is going to be the controller. It turns into a master-slave relationship because the one who has Mars wants to be the boss. They always want to be controlling. They simply want to confine that person to always paying attention to their needs, but without being reciprocal about that, without giving back. And the person who has Venus in that relationship gets a little tired of that after a while, because there is no fairness in that relationship. And sooner or later they see that they are the slave when there's no way to have a fair and harmonious relationship. They'll have to keep doing whatever the boss requires. And this can end in a very bad relationship. So what starts out well simply ends unhappily, because you can't have a good relationship when there's only one person in control and the other one is always taking the orders. Okay, and so there are other kinds of relationships, of course. What makes for a different kind of relationship than that? Well, a different kind of relationship, but one that is very, very happy, is called an enlightened relationship. And that occurs when a person has their Venus, the planet of love, in the same sign as the other love planet, Uranus. Venus is a touching, loving planet. Uranus indicates platonic or spiritual love. When two people have these two planets in the same sign, there is a wonderful harmony of their spirits. This could happen at any time in your life, and it can happen with any person in your life. And it doesn't have to last forever, but it is very sweet. The way two musicians get together and they just start making music and something wonderful comes out of it. So the purpose of an enlightened relationship is that when these two people get together, they are sharing something that is extremely soul satisfying. It may not be love of each other. It might be love for a cause, or love for a project, or it can be love of anybody else at a certain time in their life. The purpose, though, is that each person is able to help the other one go on their way. It's a learning relationship and a teaching relationship. So each person has something wonderful to gain from the other person that will help them on their journey through life. So an enlightened relationship can be between a grandparent and a grandchild. It can be between a husband and a wife. It can be between best friends. It can be between co-workers. It can be between perfect strangers who meet only for a short time, but they are sharing something that deep inside in their spirit they both love. And that's why an enlightened relationship can happen anytime, at any age, to anyone, and it is extremely enjoyable. It doesn't have to be written in stone or even on paper, but it is something that really makes for very sweet music in your heart. All right, what is another indication of an enlightened relationship? Well, another indication of an enlightened relationship is one that can be offering a great deal of support. And that occurs when one person's moon is in the same sign as another person's moon. The moon moves our feelings, and the moon is particularly nurturing and sympathetic and empathetic and understanding. So when both people have their moons in the same sign, it means they understand each other's feelings perfectly, because they both react the same way to things. And it simply means that one person is always there for the other one, and that they'll always back them up. And this can occur between people who are best friends. And since the moon is a somewhat passive sign, it is an indication of two people who can sort of take a lot from each other and not get too bothered by that, sort of let things roll off their back. And that can make for a very harmonious and easygoing kind of relationship. But remember, I said that enlightened relationships always occur between two people who are able to help each other go further on the path of life. And so another indication of an enlightened relationship is when when the moon in one person's sign is in the same sign as someone else's Neptune. This is the sign of the caregiver. And an enlightened person who is caring for someone else, let's say they're disabled, let's say it is an older parent, or it's someone who has a tremendous burden or an illness of some sort. But the caretaker seems to be the one who is perfectly happy caring for the other person. And that's because, remember, in an enlightened relationship, each one is getting something out of it. And so the pleasure that someone gets from being a caretaker or a caregiver is in the doing. It's in knowing how to comfort someone else. It makes their heart fill with love and makes them feel good. So this is a very good indication. And what it means is that when you see a relationship, or you've heard that old phrase, he ain't heavy, he's my brother, it simply means that there are people who meet others and they're quite willing to take on their burdens, or they're quite willing to share the load. And it doesn't have to be balanced or harmonious. It just happens to be appreciative in a spiritual way, which is an enlightening way. Okay, but there's one more kind of relationship we're going to be talking about. What's the next kind that we need to think about? Well, actually, there is such a thing as a frustrating relationship. And that frustrating relationship can occur because what happens is that when two people get together, each of them wants or is wishing for the perfect ending, or they're wishing for happiness, but it never comes. And they're wanting great love, but it's unrequited. And that's what can be so frustrating. The first aspect that is an indication of a frustrating relationship is when one person's sun is either square or opposing someone else's Saturn. Saturn is the planet of obstruction and delay, and it rules old age, or it rules things that happen just a little bit at a time, which can be rewarding over time, but nothing happens fast. Saturn is also a planet of doubt. And so when Saturn is squaring or opposing someone's sun, it means that they are never able to completely get together, that there's always an obstacle, or there's always a delay, or there is some obstruction that means they can't make it. And so sometimes that is an indication of unrequited love. You know, the kind of love that, well, gee, we just can't do this because of this burden or this obstacle. And that can be so frustrating that you can either spend your whole life in something like that, or you can give up and go in a different direction, and that might be a good idea. Okay, what's another aspect that indicates a frustrating relationship? Well, the other aspect that I want to talk about is one that I'm sure you've been in. In fact, we all have been at one time or another. And it is very frustrating when one person's Mars is being opposed by another person's Mars. Remember, I said Mars is a planet of energy and passion, but it can also indicate jealousy and even hate and absolute control. So in a relationship where one person's Mars is opposing the other person's Mars, it is an indication of tremendous competition between two people, even lovers, even family members. Each one has to be right at one time or another. So they're always playing a game of one-upmanship. And so it's a relationship where either it's you win and somebody else loses, or vice versa. But it is not balanced. It is not when you're both at peace. And the real root of the problem is that Mars is a cutting, sharp planet. After all, it rules war. And so there is an indication that the person who's always having to be in control, or has to one-up somebody else, or has to win at something, is actually very afraid of losing. This is a person that really lacks self-confidence. This is the person that can't share. This is the person that can't give someone else the benefit of the doubt, because they always have to be right. And so it can be very hard on a person who's in love with somebody, and they're sort of always jousting, or always sparring, or always arguing about something. In a relationship like this that is frustrating, there is always a great deal of criticism when the two Mars oppose each other. And so this can be something that is tremendously hard for people to live with. And I'm sure you've been in a case like that. Okay, what is the last aspect that indicates a frustrating relationship? Well, actually, we're almost back to where we started. Because remember, I said in a good relationship, if the ascendants or the rising signs are compatible, it sets the signs for the whole house system of each person's chart, and they would be harmonious. Even if they didn't work quite the same way, they would work in complementary ways, and that would make for a lasting marriage or partnership. But in a frustrating relationship, the opposite occurs. There is an incompatible ascendance. Remember, I'm not talking about sun signs, I'm just talking about ascendants. And what happens is that if the ascendants are not compatible, then each person operates in a totally different way. Okay, they are not coming from the same place, and they're somewhat born like that. Remember, the ascendant is set at your date and time and place of birth. In other words, it's not your fault. But if you get into a relationship, particularly a marriage, with someone who has an incompatible ascendant, then you'll never operate the same way, and there will be some barrenness in that relationship, a feeling that when you're even with them, there is an emptiness or a loneliness. And it's really no one's fault, but it does make for a great deal of frustration. And that can occur when, for instance, a person who has a fire sign rising is in a relationship with someone who has a water sign rising. Now remember, it doesn't matter which of the fire signs or which of the water signs, it's the elements that I'm talking about in the rising signs. And so we all know that water puts the fire out. And so the person with the water sign rising is extremely nurturing and actually is always there to be a good helpmate and will do anything to comfort the other person. And in fact, they can even be glad when the other person is sick or in need, because that gives them a role to fulfill, a way to help. Okay, but if the person, and so that is the sign of a person with a water sign rising. But if they're with someone that has a fire sign rising, that fire sign wants to get up and go. They have a lot of enthusiasm. They don't care if they're sick or if they need help. They just want to blast off and go into action, because fire signs do love action. So water puts the fire out, and sooner or later the only way to have happiness in that relationship is that somebody has got to just stop being who they really are. And it can be the fire sign that has to stop, or they can feel very lonely in the relationship because they're never allowed to just go forward. And that is because that wonderful water sign is always being so sympathetic that it becomes a smothering type of relationship. And that is no good. That doesn't work. And that's why it's frustrating. Another aspect that can be frustrating as far as incompatible ascendants go is when one person has an earth sign rising and another person has an air sign rising. This just doesn't work. And the reason why is that the air sign rising person is sort of like the wind. They're ephemeral. They have a lot of ideas. They're always talking and they've got an opinion about everything. But air can blow the dirt away. Air can blow the earth away. In other words, air has nowhere to go, so it just blows across that person. They don't really see eye to eye. The earth person wants to set down roots. That earth person needs some really good nurturing, and they are not getting it from somebody who has an air sign rising. And so there are no roots in that relationship. There isn't going to be any permanent growth at all, because one wants to sort of talk about things and the other one wants to set down roots. So they're not coming from the same place. And that's what happens when the ascendants are incompatible. Most people think that only your sun sign has to indicate compatibility, but that's not really true. The ascendant is the one that's setting up the whole chart in every area of your life. So those are the 4 kinds of relationships that I wanted to talk to you about tonight. The 3 aspects that indicate a good relationship, and 3 that indicate a bad relationship, and then the virtue or the wonder of an enlightened relationship, which can happen to anyone at any time, and it doesn't have to last forever. It's simply for your soul growth. It's simply a way of meeting somebody who helps you go along the path of life, who helps you get a little further toward your love or your goals, and it's a very spiritually satisfying relationship. And then the last relationship that I'm been discussing is a frustrating relationship. And so if you have a choice in your life, if there are some relationships that you are in where you think you are not getting anywhere, and no matter what you try, the other person doesn't quite understand you, well, then you might be in either a bad relationship or a frustrating relationship. I would say the best thing for you to do is give any relationship the test of time. And that means, particularly in a relationship where you think it's love at first sight, give it a while. And don't give your whole self to the relationship. Instead, take it a little bit more slowly if you can, because time is the true test of how things turn out. You'll know in time if it's meant to be. And if you feel that you are in something that could last a lifetime and you've given it a trial run, then it probably will. So I hope that you've learned something from all these different aspects that indicate relationships. And the reason why I hope you learned something from them is because our relationships help shape who we are and what we do. That's why you do need to think about them a little bit. Sorry, I'm losing my voice at the end of this, but I do hope that you've learned something from this and that this will help you identify relationships in your life, and that'll help you decide whether you want to stay in them or not. All right, thanks so much for tuning in.